Sponsored by Incogni. Traditionally, hobby rocket motors get cast into individual grains, which are then loaded into a thermal liner. This is then loaded into a case. It's kind of like a Russian nesting doll, but with a lot more explosive potential. But there's another way to do it called spin casting, and it solves some interesting problems. Once a rocket motor is large enough, the dynamics of supporting all the overhangs of the propellant grains under high G loading becomes trickier. Said in a much simpler way, the rocket isn't the only thing pulling high Gs. The propellant is too. We stack the grains like this to fit as much propellant and surface area into the motor as possible, but the downside is that the dense propellant can sag or crack under its own weight for high G flights. This is why monolithic pores, or rocket motors that are one long segment of propellant rather than individual grains, are better for high G flights. This is not just an issue for the propellant though, but the liner as well. Since the liner is typically slid into the case rather than bonded into it, the liner is actually the thing supporting the weight of all the propellant during the burn. Think about it this way. If you have 100 pounds of rocket propellant and you launch your rocket with an acceleration of 15 G, the liner needs to support about 1,500 pounds of effective load. That is a lot of pounds for what is typically a very thin and brittle liner. Phenolic composites don't bend very easy, and when they do bend, they crack. A cracked liner is a liner which will burn through, which means that a cracked liner will ruin the rocket motor. I do this thing from time to time in videos where I do a little foreshadowing, and I think it's getting kind of old, but just play along with me here. Oh boy, I wonder if we're gonna crack a thermal liner in a rocket motor. That would really be awful. Beyond these two issues with phenolic liners, there's a third, but it's harder to explain. So maybe it's easier if I show you. Welcome to the garage. This is a 4-inch diameter phenolic liner and case. This is a 6-inch diameter phenolic liner and case. Well, the whole case is much bigger, but it doesn't fit on the table. The 4-inch case and liner are designed to fit into each other. The tolerances are fairly tight. It's really easy to get them to slide together, and using a little bit of super lube, there's basically no play in here. The thing is, that doesn't really work at the 6-inch scale. These two parts are not designed to fit in each other because they're not really designed to be rocket motor components at all. If I take the outer diameter of the rocket motor liner, we get about 5.75 inches. But if we take the inner diameter of the case, we get something closer to 5.63. That's way smaller. This is an aluminum extrusion, same with the full case, as opposed to the machined part with much tighter tolerances over here. The thing with that 5.63 inches reading, it's actually not consistent either. I'm measuring about 5.63 here, but if we turn the tube 90 degrees and we measure again, we get 5.8. That's enormous. This is not a circle. Watch as this thing rolls across the table. It slows down, it speeds up. If we're lucky, at some point it might even change direction. Oh, and there it is. So there are two options for how we can deal with this. One, we can take the phenolic liner and try to bend it, but we know that phenolic is not really good in bending. It's prone to cracking. Two, we could try to bend the case to take this oval and turn it back into a circle. I'm not gonna be able to afford the cost of a machined case like this at this scale, so we gotta work with what we got. But the secret third option is to ditch this brittle liner altogether and cast a new one inside this case by spinning it. And here's the craziest part, it doesn't matter that our case is an oval. If we spin it fast enough, we can create a perfect circle inside the oval. To show you how this works, let me toss this aluminum cylinder on the lathe and I'll put an O-ring on either end. Next, I'll add the liner mixture. This isn't really liner mixture, it's just water with blue food coloring, but it'll be better for our demo, and as you'll see later, it's a lot less messy. When the machine spins up, so does the water. The slight bit of friction against the aluminum tube draws the liquid out and around the inner diameter of the case. Centrifugal force is not a real force, but the equation governing the apparent force is mass times the linear velocity squared over radius. Radius is the trick that allows us to create a perfect circle inside any shape, even an oval. When we increase radius, for instance in the bulging section of an oval, the denominator is not the only thing going up. Because we're dealing with linear velocity, which is a function of radius, this value goes up as well, more than canceling out the greater denominator. Even in the case of an extreme oval, this equation says that all water will be forced to the edges furthest from the center, so functionally any shape can create an internal circle. I trust the math, but my brain doesn't understand it, so I printed a square tube to mount on the lathe, filled it with water, and lo and behold, the math works. So in order to create a thermal liner inside the tube, we'll inject the liner mixture, spin the lathe until the liner cures, and then we can load the propellant. But first, let's find out how to make the liner itself. Now for the mixture part. In a recent video, we discussed why phenolic resin is such a good insulator. If you want to watch that video, there's a small wizard in the description down below named Borbo who will give you the link if you ask nicely. The TLDR of why it's so good as an insulator is that it forms a char layer on the surface, essentially forming a boundary layer to keep the heat from soaking through the material. Generally, there's an easy way and a hard way to develop a new thermal liner formula. The easy way is to start with an existing formula and tweak its parameters, and the hard way is to start from scratch. For the space shot, we're going the easy way. When I settled on the Risky Batman propellant formula for my space shot, you might remember the reason I named it Risky Batman is it was based on a propellant by Harry Amadeo called Reliant Robin. It's like a little cheeky play on words. My boy Harry doesn't just make rocket propellant though. He also ran some experiments on thermal liner mixtures and came up with a formula that he liked. So let's take a look at it. The largest component of this mixture is HTPB, or hydroxyl terminated polybutadiene. This is the same binder used in the solid motors I make. HTPB gets plasticized a bit with the IDP, or isodecyl pyrorganate, stiffened using a dash of TEA, or triethanolamine, then cured using MDI, which is a polycarbodiamide modified diphenylmethane diisocyanate. And with that, we've used our big word quota for the video. Now I look very smart. Just like in a solid motor formula, the liner has solids and a binder. In the liner mixture, they're just in a different ratio, and the solids don't burn to produce thrust. In this mixture, the solids are ceramic powder, carbon black, and Kevlar pulp. The ceramic powder helps reduce the thermal conductivity of the liner mixture, keeping the hot inner face of the liner from sending all that heat into the aluminum case. The carbon black helps to opacify or darken the mixture to prevent radiative heating from traveling through the liner into the case wall, and the Kevlar pulp helps to stiffen the mixture, contributing to the char layer and improving tensile strength. Much like a solid fuel mixture, every component serves a purpose, and if you understand what that purpose is, you can modify the balance of each ingredient to suit your needs. We're going to modify this mixture, but first, let's make some. Before we begin, as always, this is not a tutorial. I'm just documenting my process. In terms of safety, even though the stuff is expressly designed not to burn, you can still get hurt doing this. First, any activity using a powerful mixer can rip your hand off without missing a beat. Kind of pun intended, mixers beat things, right? Anyway, whenever I'm adding chemicals in, the mixer is off. No hands near a moving mix paddle, and the mixer I have specifically prevents this with a guard that disables the motor when removed. Second, the process involves a lot of work on a powerful lathe, which can rip off much more than your hand. As the sticker says, this machine does not know the difference between metal and flesh, nor does it care. It will rip your body to shreds without a second thought, and it will hurt the whole time you're dying. Safety with a lathe means no loose clothing, no long hair, nothing near a spinning chuck, and if you want more lathe safety resources, they are down in the description below. I would also advise you to think pretty hard before you click on any images or videos you find related to lathe safety. Finally, the chemicals used in this process are relatively tame, but I see no reason to risk it. So for the whole process, I'm wearing a respirator. Partway through, I switched from a half face to a full face. It's slightly harder to get a perfect seal with a full face setup, but I found it to be much more comfortable for long periods of time, since you don't need to deal with your safety glasses fogging up. Okay, thanks for watching the safety part. Let's make this stuff. I started off making batches of a few kilograms at a time, then spin casting them into small sections of aluminum tubing. We only need about a kilogram of liner for these tests, so there's a lot of wasted material, but my mixers aren't optimized for batches that small, and this problem goes away once we start building bigger motors. Much like with solid motor mixing, the order you add each chemical in matters. I start with the liquids and then mix them thoroughly to get a homogeneous mix. Most of the smaller components like the antioxidants and surfactants also get added at this stage. There's some thought as to whether it's worth measuring each component into a separate container or combining them together early on. You can save time by using fewer separate measuring cups, but it's easier to instantly ruin the batch this way, so it's worth being careful. Especially with liquids, once it's in the bowl, it can't come back out. After the liquids, I add the carbon black to opacify the mix. This is sometimes referred to as lamp black and is a commonly used pigment in paints. Technically, many things can act as an opacifier. The aluminum in a solid rocket motor formula is primarily used as a fuel, but in high enough concentrations, it also opacifies the mix from an off-white slightly clear color to a gray one. Without this, large solid fuel rocket motors can experience what's referred to as self-ignition. This is where the light and radiant energy of the burning core of the rocket motor is so intense that it can ignite the propellant below the burning surface, which produces unpredictable burning and most likely More of a bomb than a rocket motor. After the carbon black is mixed in thoroughly, I move on to the ceramic powder. These little guys are branded as thermocells and are actually a paint insulating additive. When mixed with paint, they can legitimately change the heating or cooling bill in your house, and when mixed in a thermal liner, they can legitimately change the thermal conductivity of the liner. The final and most annoying part of this is adding the Kevlar pulp. This stuff is so lightweight and has such low density that it's difficult to measure out. If you get some on your gloves, the static forces literally overcome gravity. It takes quite a while for the Kevlar to mix in, and once it's in, the liner moves from a thin liquid to a thick sludge. For liner performance, the more Kevlar, the better, but the harder it will be to get a good spin cast, and the less the liner will flow. At this point, the liner mixture is filled with air, and much like a batch of propellant, we need to remove as much of that as possible. The mix went under vacuum, and during this, I prepped the inside surface of a 6-inch diameter aluminum tube with acetone to clean it. We also need a way to prevent the liner from flowing out either end of the tube. Using Onshape, I cooked up a simple little casting plug. The plug goes on either end of the case and uses a thick O-ring to properly seal the liquids in. Getting the diameter of the O-ring groove was a little bit tricky because I wanted the fit to be snug, but not too difficult to remove after the fact. In the next video, when we make a motor with this liner, we're going to use a more specialized casting plug too, but let's keep it simple for these tests. I then mixed up a nice banana smoothie of curative to harden the mixture and added it to the bowl. Again, much like mixing propellant, once this goes in, the curing process begins and you're on the clock. I typically mix on medium or low speeds for solid propellant to prevent particle shearing of the ammonium perchlorate, but it's safe to mix on high speed for the liner since that's not a concern here. After this, the mix bowl goes under vacuum again to remove any bubbles introduced in the curative cycle, and I used this time to clean all the parts of the mix equipment that I could before the liner hardened. Speaking from experience, no matter how tired, sweaty, or burnt out you feel after making propellant or liners, you've got to clean the mixer right away. It becomes so much worse to clean once this stuff hardens. Borderline impossible. I took a glass beaker, ran it through the mix, and loaded a bit at a time into the tube on the lathe. I know it's easy to see, but this stuff is so disgusting and messy, and I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of warm in like a... It's not good. It's not good to touch. I don't know, man. I'm not a fan. After coating the inside a bit and running the lathe on low speed to distribute the mix, I cranked it up to higher speed and let the cure begin. I periodically checked on the mixture by stopping the lathe to see if it would still flow, and after a few hours, it had hardened enough to let it sit overnight. But in the morning, things did not look so great. After pulling off the casting cap, I realized the mix hadn't cured very well, and part of it was stuck to the casting cap itself. I could still move it around with my fingers. It had hardened enough to hold its shape generally speaking, but not anywhere close enough to support 100 pounds of rocket propellant. At this point, I hadn't made a rocket motor in several months, so I thought it might be possible that my curative had become less effective. When this kind of thing happens, it's actually very easy to correct for it. You just change the ratio of curative to HTPB. Finding the correct ratio involves producing a set of isolated test coupons, each with different ratios of curative to HTPB, and these are called gum stocks. I set up a tray of extremely cursed ice cubes using different batches of curative and different ratios. I also produced a set of these with ammonium perchlorate mixed in to ensure that the next time I produced propellant, I achieved the hardness desired. Propellant that is too hard will crack, and that makes your motor explode, and propellant that's too soft will... You know what? That might be a topic for another time, but it will also make your motor explode. I won't get into the numbers on all these, but what I can tell you is that after performing these gum stock tests, letting them cure for a week, and then measuring the hardness of each, my cure ratio is fine. I found nothing. Each sample performed about as expected based on the ratio between curative and HTPB, so that's not an issue. I thought about it for a little bit and rechecked my notes for the exact quantities of each component in the mixture, but that came up short too. The only error that I could think of that would lead to an uncured liner would be something undocumented. Maybe the scale was set to the wrong unit for an ingredient. Maybe I aimed for a mixture with an extra 0 somewhere. Without a better answer, I resolved to mix a more precise batch on the next attempt. The cure hardness, unfortunately, wasn't the only issue either. See the difference in color as I pull the mixture apart? Some of the liner has this gray texture, while other parts of the liner remain that deep black color. This is bigger than a cosmetic issue, and I think I know what's going on. Whatever created this gray color would have to be something white to offset the carbon black in the mixture. The only possible culprit is the ceramic powder. My theory is that under high G loading, basically spinning too fast, it's possible that the ceramic powder floated to the top of the mix. This is a problem because the liner needs to bond really tightly with the propellant to keep hold of it during high G flights. If the inner surface of the liner has a bunch of ceramic powder at the top, it'll be like trying to bond propellant to a bunch of sand. Armed with this theory, let's start modifying the liner mixture. We'll go down slightly on the percentage of ceramic powder and double the amount of Kevlar pulp. This should be a win-win situation. There's less ceramic powder available to float to the surface, but mostly, doubling the Kevlar pulp will thicken the mixture greatly. The Kevlar will produce a better char layer overall, and a more viscous liner mixture will make it harder for the ceramic to move around and float to the top. On attempt 2, I wanted to put my best foot forward in the name of precision. I prepped 2 separate lengths of 6-inch 3/16 tubing and got to work mixing. I prepped 2 because, you know, we might need another try after this. Each component was measured and mixed down to the 1/10 of a gram, with process control tracked down to the minute. I also switched over to a faster kicking curative than the banana smoothie. This one is just bland, the flavor isn't as nice, but it should cure a little faster than the first attempt. After the full mix process, I vacuumed the liner to get the bubbles out. And this time, to load the liner into the tube, I tried a new approach. I loaded 900 milliliter caulk tubes and purchased the longest caulk dispenser I could find to squirt liner down the inner length of particularly long rocket motors. The big deal with this approach is it allows me to more tightly control exactly how much liner mixture is loaded into the motor case, which allows me to shoot for an exact thickness of liner. Here, I'm shooting for about 1/4 inch thick. While still flowable, this mixture with double the Kevlar of the last mixture was much more viscous. Just like before, I began the process of spinning at slow speeds to even the mix out, then went up to a slightly higher RPM to really spread it out. After the mixture had hardened for several hours, I removed the casting plugs to find a liner that still hadn't cured. While the problem of the ceramic spheres floating to the surface had certainly gotten better, the mixture was still far too soft. It seemed like the only reason the liner looked better this time was because of the higher Kevlar content. I have to say, while I really love producing videos about these projects, some of the effort that goes into them is genuinely hard to convey. It's not like this is the end of the world, but each mix does take like 24 hours with the cure included, and there's a lot of manual labor that goes into that. Cleaning the bowl, cleaning the mixer, keeping liner off the floor and the lathe, wearing a respirator for hours at a time. It's like really fun the first few times, and then it becomes like steadily less fun each time. It's obviously not that bad to ruin a little test batch like this. You know, it's not like we ruined an entire motor. Like that would be awful. That would be so bad. That would feel terrible to ruin an entire motor. So I'm glad I didn't do that. Hey, by the way, you should make sure you're subscribed for no reason. At this point in the undercured liner problem, I had to go to the source. I was fully out of ideas on what the problem could be here, so I hit up Harry, the guy who came up with the original mix. One thing he mentioned in our conversation is that while triethanolamine was a helpful chemical in the mixture, it was also one that was prone to contamination by water. Triethanolamine is hygroscopic, which means it readily absorbs water. Readily is a bit of an understatement though. This stuff can and will absorb the moisture out of any air around it, so it's almost like a liquid form of those little silica gel packets that you're not really supposed to eat no matter how delicious they look. Water content in a liner would absolutely cause an incomplete cure though, even in small amounts. I have no way to analyze the water content in my supply of triethanolamine, so I can't say for sure that that's what was causing the undercuring. What we can do though is ditch that small amount of TEA and make a new batch. In addition to removing the TEA, I'm also going to reduce the ceramic powder content further, increase the content of carbon black, and nearly double the amount of Kevlar pulp again. And I made a few changes to the binder ratios as well. With each round of testing, I refined the mixing approach, getting bold on this one and measuring some components straight into the mix bowl. This is sporty since there's no room for error, but it does really speed the process up. It also reduces waste and measurement errors due to liquids that stick to the sides of measuring cups. Going up to this amount of Kevlar pulp seems to be close to the limit of how much we can get in there without making a liner that won't flow at all. When the mixer stops, instead of flowing back into place like Risky Batman propellant does, the liner holds its shape because it's so viscous. Once again, I loaded the liner into the caulk tube, aiming to use just the right amount to give us a 1/4 inch of liner thickness around the inner diameter of the case. After loading the tube, I cut the tip off and got to work. While this mixture is curing, does anyone want to guess what I'm doing here? What do you think these bubbles are from? If you want a hint, here's one, and here's another hint. You'll get your answer in the next video. Anyway, it's been a few hours and it's time to pop the casting plug off.
There it is. Whoa, that's so good. Wow, it's perfectly conformed.
You know what they say, right? Third time's a charm. The internal texture was excellent. No ceramic powder floating to the top, and a bumpy surface that should help increase propellant bonding area. In addition, the thickness was right on point. The casting plug came out clean, and the liner was fully cured to a nice, hard, rubbery feel. I was very happy with the way this third try came out, and while there are still 1 or 2 more things that I want to slightly modify in the formula, I felt ready to put this liner to the test. The test here, the last unknown, is how fast this liner erodes, and the answer to that is very complicated. There's not a ton of data relevant to erosion on this type of liner online, so we'll have to find some way around that, and you can bet we're going to talk more about it in the next video. For now, here's the formula I landed on for that third test. If you'd like to try making your own, I strongly recommend you do a few practice castings like this before using it in a motor. And while it's safer in some ways than making rocket propellant, just be aware of the safety aspects I mentioned earlier. Your ingredient quality may also vary quite a bit depending on your source. Again, just like with rocket propellant, where you get your chemicals from matters. All right. Now, before I show you how this all comes together in a rocket motor, I would like to thank the sponsor for today's video. This video is sponsored by Incogni. I spend a lot of time online. I mean, I make YouTube videos, but I'm also all over the place on the internet for research on these projects. Sometimes that means I'm signing up for sketchy accounts to find papers, and I always think a little bit about where that data goes. Not just account details, but other traces of info that might get left behind. Maybe that's an age, a birthday, a record of something that you bought. Maybe it's more personal stuff, like your credit card info, social security number. I say maybe, but the reality is that if you exist on the internet, this information about you often gets bundled up and sold to data brokers, who then sell it to businesses. And it's not all above board either. These lists of personal info often end up in the hands of criminals. You could spend a bunch of time, effort, and energy tracking down every place that your personal data has ended up, and look, if that sounds like a fun time to you, I mean, more power to you. You're just gonna have a lot of work ahead of you. If you don't have hours and days and weeks to dedicate to that task, that is where Incogni comes in. Incogni is a service that reaches out to these data brokers on your behalf to request removal of your data. Occasionally, that process isn't so smooth, which is why Incogni will also deal with companies that don't cooperate. As a service, Incogni is constantly looking out for your data 24/7 to make sure that it can't be spread far and wide. You don't need to recheck any of that manually. They handle all of that constantly in the background. Incogni effectively saves you an enormous amount of work to make your personal info safe and keep it safe. If you want to give it a shot, you can use the link in the description below to get 60% off an annual Incogni plan. That is 60% off a whole year of keeping your personal data your personal data. Thanks so much to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you for watching. My name is Joe Barnard. May your skies be blue and your winds be low.